Each summer, Regent Law students have an opportunity to study international human rights law in Strasbourg, France. And part of that program is a visit to the European Court of Human Rights that's based in Strasbourg. It's the most active and powerful human rights court in the world. And so every time we visit, a lawyer or judge from that court will come and talk with us to discuss the court's work. And a few years ago, a staff lawyer was doing so and describing an important case that was decided that year. And the question was this: does the right to life, which is a basic human right protected by the European Court, does the right to life include the right to die? In other words, is it a basic human right for someone to have the right to commit suicide or to have assistance in doing so? And the lawyer said this. She said, the court's answer was no. The right to life does not include the right to die, which sounded like the right answer to me. But then she added, but that's what the court said now. But in 10 years, who knows? What an odd way to talk. Not just about a policy question, but about a fundamental human right. So how did we get to the point where we would talk about human rights that way? Well, the human rights movement arose after World War II as a moral response to the atrocities that took place before and during the war. Genocide. Millions of people viewed as disposable, tortured and killed. And the world came together and said, never again. And we insisted that all human beings have the inherent dignity and worth and deserve protection for basic human rights. And so at Nuremberg, we tried Hermann Goering and 21 other Nazi leaders for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the nations of the world testified that there are certain basic rights that are fundamental and universal. They belong to all people at all times. They don't depend on your race, your wealth, power, or influence. They're rooted in a basic concept of human dignity and worth. Today, though, the human rights movement and human rights themselves are in danger. Increasingly, human rights are no longer seen as universal or fundamental. They're certainly not rooted in a transcendent source. They're a human creation, and they can vary and change as culture and priorities change. Which brings us back to the European Court and the right to die. As predicted, the European Court is now reconsidering whether respect for private and family life includes the right to have assistance in committing suicide. Now, how can it reconsider that position? Because human rights, according to the European Court, are evolving, and they change with society and its values. So guess what one of the main criteria is for determining whether something is a human right? Whether there's a European consensus that it is a right. So for example, after 16 years of ruling the other way, in 2002, the European Court decided that there is a fundamental human right for someone who's undergone a sex change operation to change their birth certificate to reflect their new sexual identity. Now, that wasn't based largely on the text of the European Convention. It wasn't based on a transcendent or universal standard of fundamental rights. No, it's a right because there was an international legal trend, a trend toward greater protection for transsexuals. A trend, a social consensus. Those bases for human rights are unsustainable and dangerous. And this is not just an over-there problem. The U.S. Supreme Court has begun citing European Court of Human Rights decisions. And in at least one area, whether punishments are cruel and unusual, especially cases involving the death penalty, the U.S. Supreme Court now looks to evidence of a societal consensus to determine the scope of constitutional rights. Rights that depend on a social consensus or that vary with contemporary views of good public policy are not true rights at all. They're certainly not universal or fundamental. They exist only so long as society chooses to keep them. And since they're based on a social consensus, the dominant view of the majority, they no longer do the critical things that rights must do. Protect minorities and the weak and the vulnerable. We need to return to the fundamental moral insight that began the human rights movement nearly 70 years ago, that all human beings have inherent dignity and worth. And that dignity and worth does not come from government. It's not based on an agreement of a number of governments coming together. That dignity and worth comes from a transcendent source, from God Himself. Rights that protect this dignity and worth, too, are rooted in the transcendent. They're true at all places, all times. They don't change with the newest social policy or with the latest consensus. In short, human rights, to be meaningful and effective, have to be rooted in the right. We have a desperate need today for men and women with that concept of human rights. We need you today. We need you at the United Nations and the European Court of Human Rights. We need you at the helm of NGOs protecting human rights. We need you at the side of men and women who are being abused or oppressed or enslaved. We need you to be a voice for the voiceless. We need you to testify to the transcendent source of human rights and to call the human rights movement back to its original vision.